Now, all of this, of course, taking place against the backdrop of the Prime Minister's 7th visit to America as Prime Minister. It kicked off on Thursday. He will be meeting US President Joe Biden on Friday. Prime Minister Modi believed in adding a personal touch, as always, during his interactions with the leaders of the world's oldest democracy. Remember, last time he was in Washington, it was Ab ki baar Trump Sarkar. But what now? Because there's a new administration which is keeping human rights at the forefront of its agenda. Plus, with Afghanistan and COVID having changed the world, how will the new equation work? That's going to be our top focus tonight. Take a look at what lies ahead for Prime Minister Modi and Joe Biden.
After boarding Air India One in Delhi and some paperwork utilizing the long flight, Prime Minister Modi touched down at Maryland's Andrews Air Force Base for a 3-day tour. To a rousing welcome by the Biden administration and a rapturous one by the diaspora on a rain-soaked evening. Modi stepped out of his motorcade to interact with the enthusiastic crowd, chanting his name and Bharat Mata Ki Jai. What is your take on Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit and how should he engage the world?
Well, as a student, I recognize that it's a monumental time with the issues that's going around the world, especially with Afghanistan and the tremors in the Indo-Pacific. So it's a monumental time and it's great to be here while the Prime Minister is here.
I'm very happy and excited that Narendra Modi ji is in our Washington DC here. And he is such a big leader. Everybody knows around the world, and he's bringing good things for India.
I look forward to this meeting especially. The changes that have taken place in Afghanistan, I'm sure it's going to be a big talk about that with President Biden.
From the airbase, Prime Minister's motorcade went straight to the Hotel Villard Intercontinental in Pennsylvania Avenue. Massive security presence outside his hotel. That's Hotel Villard, which is where he stays normally. This time around also, he's staying at this historic hotel, and there is absolute security presence and barricading of the hotel. If you see on the right and the left-hand side, there are these cement huge block barricades to ensure that no cars really pass through this entire lane, this entire road. Indian Americans also lined up at Modi's Washington hotel with Indian colours. Prime Minister Modi in a tweet said that diaspora is India's strength and that he was grateful for the rousing reception. India today is tracking every engagement of the Prime Minister in the United States. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has arrived here at his hotel here, Hotel Villard. That's where he's entering the hotel. That's the tenement that has been built for him for security reasons. The entire area over here has been cordoned off. Nobody being allowed to enter this entire area. If you can see, there are security personnel who've been deployed. He has a jam-packed day one in US. The highlight being the crucial bilateral meeting with US Vice President Kamala Harris, which is scheduled at 12:45 a.m. Indian Standard Time on Friday. He will also hold bilateral talks with Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison at 11 p.m. Indian Standard Time. A bilateral meeting with US President Joe Biden, an in-person Quad meet to counter China, and a crucial address at the United Nations General Assembly. Prime Minister Modi's US tour is pivotal and path-breaking in many ways. With Geeta Mohan in Washington, Bureau Report, India Today.
Let me first go straight across to Geeta Mohan, our diplomatic affairs editor, who is in Washington. Geeta, the meeting with the businessman is more or less over. The next challenge, of course, is meeting with the new administration. First, Kamala Harris tonight, and then tomorrow, Joe Biden. Is this the challenges? What's the sense you get compared to what the Modi equation during the Trump Sarkar was? Is this a more difficult visit in a way, given the multiple challenges that in a way the new global world order faces, from Afghanistan to Indo-Pacific to COVID?
a difficult but also, Rajdeep, a critical one. And that's the reason why both sides will, in many ways, then one focus on what is really important to them and what works in their interest, their own national interest. And that's why, while we saw a great bonhomie between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Donald Trump, it might not be similar in terms of optics, but it certainly is going to be similar in terms of substance. And Rajdeep, it could maybe be a little more than just what it was during Trump administration. Why? Because dynamics in the region have changed. Afghanistan is very important. India is going to play a critical role, and the United States of America would require India's assistance in that entire region. There have been conversations of how India can really assist, and U.S. Washington, D.C. has been engaged with New Delhi. So there is going to be a lot of substance in the talk. Even Kamala Harris, for that matter, Rajdeep, while she speaks of human rights and while the off-record briefings of her officials spoke of democracy and how democratic values could come up during conversations, she will also focus on strategic cooperation as Vice President of the United States of America, keeping Afghanistan in mind, keeping China in mind. Right now, it is more important for them to be together than to be apart.
Kamala Harris meeting in a couple of hours from now, am I correct? What time is that meeting expected?
Well, it's about 3:30 a.m. India time. This would be about late afternoon here in Washington, D.C. Right now, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, after the business meeting, is going to hold his first bilateral meeting with Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison. He's also likely to meet the Japanese Prime Minister and Kamala Harris, of course. That is going to be held late afternoon, which would be about 3:30 a.m. in India. It is going to be crucial. It's going to be held at the Eisenhower building that is adjacent to the White House within the complex. And that's where the meeting is going to take place. The Quad meeting and the bilateral meeting with Biden will take place tomorrow in the White House. So we are looking forward to what really comes of the meeting between Kamala Harris and Narendra Modi. There could be some sparks, but there should also be some areas of convergences, Rajdeep.
Very quickly, how many businessmen did the Prime Minister meet? Were they all, a lot of them one-on-one conversations, we are told, including with CEOs like from companies like Qualcomm?
Well, Rajdeep, interesting because, in all the past visits that Prime Minister Modi has had, he's always had round tables with business community. But this time we chose 5 top CEOs of India, of the US, and all of them had a one-on-one with Prime Minister, 5-minute briefing followed by 15-minute conversation with the CEOs, where he also took in their update or their ideas on how to ease doing business with India, and also then spoke about how they should be looking to and looking at India.
Very, very interesting there, Geeta Mohan, tracking all that's happening in Washington, D.C. Thanks very much for joining us. You've got a long day ahead of you. Let's raise those questions now. How should the Prime Minister be dealing with a new U.S. administration? Chemistry or hard-nosed diplomacy this time to dictate ties? Can Mr. Modi and Biden really write a new chapter in Indo-US relationships? Afghanistan, Indo-Pacific, where's the main challenge at the moment for the two countries? Joining me now, Sanjay Puri is chairman of the US-India Political Action Committee. Joins me from Washington. Michael Rubin, senior fellow at American Enterprise Institute, Washington. Tanvi Madan, also at Brookings Institute in Washington. Navtesh Sarna, former Indian ambassador to the United States. KC Singh, former secretary to the MEA. So lots of voices that we'll come to get a sense of what to expect. Navtesh Sarna, let's start with you because you've done this before. You worked with prime ministers when they come to Washington. Does every visit, in a way, is it very distinct to the previous one, despite the fact that India and America now seem to have a relationship that goes beyond the democratic, Republican context, that all prime ministers now can deal with US presidents without getting caught up, as in the past, in a democratic Republican standoff?
Thank you, Rajdeep. You said it. Every visit is the same and every visit is different. I think the fact is that the India-US relationship is now stabilized into a strategic partnership which has seen a steady upward graph for the last 20 odd years, no matter what administration is there in the White House. At the same time, the challenges in every visit and every meeting are different, depending upon the global, the regional context. And of course, the chemistry between the two leaders is always different. And Prime Minister Modi has established good personal chemistry with President Obama and with President Trump. And he has met President Biden before, but not when the latter was president. Biden knows India well. Biden has been focused on foreign policy for long decades. So I think, the personality nuances aside, I mean, you won't expect the kind of Trumpian, personal bonhomie here, but you'll see something very correct and very, very focused on the agenda. I think that's the way it's going to be. There's a full plate before the two leaders, and they will carry on. Of course, it's not a usual visit in the sense that there's no big community event. There's not been a big business event. You've seen 5 CEOs meeting the Prime Minister separately. One reason, of course, is that the program has been kept compact because of the COVID protocols. And also at the same time, it's important to give a messaging that India is open for investment and so on. I think this is a good balance. So that's what it looks like at the moment.
Let's come to the plate that you're talking. Let me go around the table that we have to find out what they think is the most important thing on the plate. Tanvi Madan, what do you think is the most important thing on the plate? You're there in Washington. What, according to you, is critical in a way? What should be top of the plate or top of the agenda?
I think the top of the agenda you've kind of seen for both the bilateral and the Quad summit is going to be the challenges to India's West and East, whether it is the kind of fallout from American withdrawal from Afghanistan, the situation there today, but also for both the US and India, its primary challenge these days is a more assertive China in the region. So I think we'll see a lot of discussions around that. And it's connected, not just to the strategic sphere, but the economic and technology sphere as well. And so what was interesting about the meeting, for example, with the CEOs is who they were. They were CEOs of companies in so-called new technologies. But take somebody like the CEO of Qualcomm. Yes, it's an economic, it's important from the economic perspective. But what they were talking about is trusted relationships in the telecommunication sector, supply chain security, resilience. That is very much about the China challenge as it is the economic challenge. There are others around the table who can talk more about the importance of, I think, rebalancing this relationship a little from the Trump administration, where it was very only defense and security focused. So I think that's the other thing we will see. This relationship didn't really need repair, unlike some American alliances in January. It has seen and already witnessed some rebalancing, and I think there'll be a sense of trying to drive that home as well. Conversations of COVID, climate change, economy, and strategy.
Michael Rubin, what's top of the table? What, according to you, should be top of the table at the moment? Strategic issues, or should it be the economic partnership that can go beyond possibly a strategic partnership?
The answer to both those questions is yes. What I would caution Prime Minister Modi is that what's more important right now is the chemistry. It is the symbolism. Because when I talk to others who have met, other heads of state who have met President Biden, they say he's not the same President Biden that he was a decade ago. He's not as in command of the details. So the atmospherics are going to be most important. What actually is what I'm more curious about are some of the sideline discussions by some of his aides with the National Security Council, perhaps with Congress, in order to address the details which President Biden may not have full command over. That said, I fully agree. Supply chain is front and center. Generally speaking, how are we going to add substance to the symbolism of the Quad? And that's going to come out in both his other bilateral meetings as well as the Quad summit itself.
KC Singh, what's more important? How India deals with the Quad? This first face-to-face meeting of the leaders of the Quad? Is it the one-on-one, the first official one-on-one between Prime Minister Modi and the US President in the backdrop of America's withdrawal from Afghanistan, China's increasing assertiveness in the region? What would you prioritize? What should India be prioritizing?
Look, when you look at President Biden's speech address to the UN General Assembly, which he delivered on Wednesday, most of the themes are there. He mentions the Quad there, and he says Quad, essentially three issues he mentions with the Quad. Climate change, he mentions emerging technologies, and health security. So I think vaccine initiative of Quad is extremely important, because vaccine inequity is what is being talked about, what UN will be discussing. In many large parts of the world where really hardly any vaccines are available. So Quad will have to pick up that.
No, so are you saying Quad will overshadow the one-on-one?
But the priorities are different. You see, India has gone there.
Sorry to intervene. Do you believe Quad will overshadow the one-on-one?
No, I think No, I think what Quad will do will be to focus on these three issues. What India wants to talk about would also be Afghanistan, which was hardly mentioned by President Biden in the UNGA address. He's focused, looking at that speech, he's focused on China, whether emerging technologies, vaccines, anything else, infrastructure. His focus is China. And that is why the shadow on the Quad is actually of the Australia, UK, US, AUKUS agreement, which has got French really riled.
That's right.
Because their $80 or $90 billion worth of submarine deal is gone. But that tells you that when Biden's made up his mind about something, he didn't even care about what impact it may have on France. So he just went ahead and said, we'll give the nuclear submarine technology. And that alters the dynamics, the military dynamics in Indo-Pacific. Because the Chinese have been prepared basically with their missiles to hit anything within a certain range. But if the Australians get, and the Americans get bases there, and the Australians get the nuclear submarines, those become absolutely unhittable. And they come from a greater range, and they can lie submerged. So that's altered the dynamics. But the interesting thing is we should not forget the meeting with the Vice President. If you remember, the irritants in the past were human rights, democracy, how BJP was behaving within the country. And don't forget, the Pegasus issue has come up in the Supreme Court. They're setting up a committee. And here, when you're talking about emerging technologies, President Biden has said at the UN that emerging technologies can be used to empower or to repress. Now, you know, that's it. These are issues that we cannot ignore.
Can I stop
Americans are aware of all this.
Can I stop you,
therefore, there is the...
Can I just stop you for a moment, because you mentioned the meeting with Kamala Harris, and I just want to go for a moment to Sanjay Puri, chairman of the US-India Political Action Committee, because Kamala Harris, first US Vice President of part Indian origin, but also someone who's had a slightly testy relationship with this administration, especially when it comes to human rights, when it comes to Kashmir. Do you see, though, all of that being papered over, that this will now be a fresh start in a way, both for Kamala Harris and the Modi-led government?
Hi, Rajdeep. Nice to talk to you. Coming to Kamala Harris, Rajdeep, the politics in this country is changing and has changed. The Democratic Party is very different than what it was 5 years or even 10 years ago. So Kamala Harris and Biden are paying close attention to what the Progressive Caucus, which is led by Pramila Jayapal, as you know, who had a little bit of an issue with the foreign minister, current foreign minister, Jai Shankar.
Yes.
So I think there is some relationship building that needs to happen. Human rights will continue to play an issue. Obviously, this is a good relationship building platform for Prime Minister Modi. But I think human rights, religious freedom, those things will continue to play because they are being pushed by the Democratic Party, and politics does play an important role. I agree with some of the points made by Tanvi and others that one thing that I think President Biden is looking for is for India to step up its vaccine production in the COVAX, because despite what the United States is saying, they're using vaccine diplomacy against China right now. When you start seeing 500 million and over 1 billion vaccine doses being given from Pfizer to others, it is telling people, we have the best vaccines in the world, Rajdeep, and do you want to be with us, or do you want to be with people whose vaccines are not proven? So this is where I think India and United States are going to have
an interesting point, because one of India's concerns, of course, is Western countries have been hoarding vaccines. You've also got, of course, the COVAX alliance, and hopefully India will begin exports next month itself. But let's look at that domestic relationship for a moment. I just want to play out what Prime Minister Modi said when he went last time to the US. Remember the Howdy Modi visit, and then I'll get my panelists back to respond to that. How does Prime Minister Modi now deal with President Biden in comparison with President Trump? Just listen in.
We in India have connected well with President Trump. The words of candidate Trump, "Ab ki baar Trump sarkar."
Ab ki baar Trump sarkar. Michael Rubin, will that come to haunt, you believe, the Indian Prime Minister? Or is that something which is part of what happens during a presidential year? This is a new beginning, Michael Rubin.
There is no new beginnings in Washington. I certainly think it will be a factor in the overall reputation of Prime Minister Modi, especially among progressives. I think Sanjay was right, absolutely, that we have a situation in which the progressives in Congress are increasingly powerful, are trying to shape the narrative, which is why it's so essential that behind the scenes, that the atmospherics and the chemistry is good. It would be a mistake to talk too much about Afghanistan because President Biden is so set in his ways. Perhaps that's a conversation that can be had with National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan instead. Likewise, what we've seen at other meetings, for example, when Iraqi Prime Minister Mustafa Kadhimi came, is that former Secretary of State John Kerry had representatives in almost every meeting, wanted to hear about climate change, and in order to improve the chemistry, it would behoove Prime Minister Modi to play along and then deal with the strategic issues behind the scenes.
But are you saying, Michael Rubin, that issues of human rights, religious freedom will be raised at all? Because those are contentious issues. Or is this basically an icebreaker meeting?
What I'm saying is that the core of the relationship between India and the United States isn't simply between President Biden and Prime Minister Modi. It's important that the chemistry between the two leaders is good. But behind the scenes, much more important is going to be the relationships which are established by their various staff members, which aren't going to be on camera, because even though I doubt Biden will bring up human rights issues in his meeting, Congress cannot be ignored.
Navteej Sarda, you've dealt with the complexity in that sense of Washington. Do you believe that, as Mr. Rubin says, this is not just about Prime Minister Modi and President Biden, it's about the institutional framework, it's also about other stakeholders, and how do you deal with them? Do you believe contentious issues should be set aside and the focus should be at the moment on confidence building?
Well, Rajdeep, you know, a short, compact prime ministerial visit does not touch everything. They don't resolve all problems. They don't get into nitty-gritty. This is a first meeting between President Biden and Prime Minister Modi after the Biden presidency has started. This is the first in-person quad. President Biden needs good visit here, by not only by India, but the others. He's under pressure on domestic issues. He's under pressure post-Afghanistan. He wants to show that America is back in leadership. America is taking on China in a strong way, and that's why we left Afghanistan. America is engaged in the Indo-Pacific. I do not think that he or Kamala Harris will use these meetings to raise contentious issues and clear the pitch. If anything has to be mentioned, it will be mentioned in the sense of how...
Tanvi Madan, how critical is India as an ally at the moment? In this post-Afghanistan world, an assertive China, India part of the Quad, the first physical meeting between the four Quad leaders. Is India now emerging as an important strategic partner, possibly, and outside the usual hyphenation completely with Pakistan?
So I think, if you look at the first 8 months of the Biden administration, this administration has spent more time on India, engaging their Indian counterparts than any previous, and I mean any since the last 75 years of Indian history, any previous U.S. administration. Mm-hmm. There's been an engagement at the senior-most levels. The president, prime minister have had multiple calls. Secretary of State Blinken has probably had more calls with Jaishankar than most American allies. And this is partly, I think it's for two reasons. One, convergence on some key strategic issues, and the fact that India is relevant to each of the Biden administration's key priorities, whether that is tackling China, whether that's tackling climate change, whether that's tackling COVID. Mm-hmm. And India has reciprocated, saying we're willing to actually work with you. I think the second reason it's been is crises. Whether it has been the COVID surge in India, whether it's been the withdrawal from Afghanistan, whether it's kind of the broader China-India crisis. I think, that too has made India relevant to this kind of broader conversation in the US. Let me just say one thing, though, and I think this is why whatever kind of, statements were made last year, or I think it was 3 years ago at Howdy Modi, mm-hmm. You have seen the Biden administration continue to invest in India. This is a mutually beneficial relationships. That's why it's sustainable. That's why it's better today than it was earlier this year. It was better in January 2020, than it was in 2017. Mm-hmm. But it does help the relationship when it has bipartisan support. And therefore, it's always for the best traditionally, when India has kind of stayed out of American politics or putting its thumb on the scale, because as a fellow democracy, India knows that you never know what the political dispensation is going to look like, 6 months from now, let alone, or a year from now, let alone 2 or 3 years from now.
But this is a presidency that's here for the next 3 years, unlike the last time when, of course, it was when we were in a presidential year, KC Singh. But as Tanvi Madan is pointing out, she seems to suggest that India is more relevant in a way today than ever before. Because of COVID pandemic, India's contribution possibly to the global vaccine program, because of China and assertive China, what it does to Indo-Pacific, because of the so-called vacuum that now exists in Afghanistan, and how do you sort of have some containment strategy there? You agree with that? That India is actually more relevant now than perhaps we were even a few years ago?
I think what some of the others have said, I agree with. That with somebody like President Biden, because he has a close mind on Afghanistan and he's very touchy on it, and he goes on repeating that that's the best option he had, even though he's had scathing criticism within the country. Mm-hmm. And only last week, his Secretary of State had to face very tough questions when both sides in the House Foreign Affairs Committee piled on to Pakistan. And they said, you should examine. And then Blinken had to say, we'll go into the last 20 years to see why Pakistan was duplicitous, mm-hmm. and why we've landed in this kind of a mess. So the congressional mood is very negative on Pakistan. But Biden is very touchy about it. So you don't raise Afghanistan with him. There is nothing to gain from there. So what you have to do essentially is go along with him on China, go along with on climate change. He would expect something from India because Glasgow is coming up later this year, the COP26. He has committed zero emission neutrality by 2050. Mm-hmm. The Chinese have done it by 2060. So India would be under pressure before Glasgow to give some commitment. Mm-hmm. And it's good that one of the companies, CEOs of one of the companies that called on Prime Minister had to do with solar energy and new technologies in that regard. So I think what we should do is get the new technologies, go along with him to the extent that we can insofar as Indo-Pacific is concerned. But Afghanistan is a mess we'll have to clear ourselves or deal with ourselves. So Biden's just scooted, he's left. And there's very little he's going to do about addressing your concerns. But I think we should really touch base with the Congress and see what Congress does. Because there were calls there for sanctions on Pakistan. I don't think that will happen. But nevertheless, the pressure will have to be from there. But Team Biden is not into it. They've just cut and run.
So interesting, in a sense, what you're saying is Indo-Pacific, in a sense, will be the priority much more than what's happened in Afghanistan. Just want to get from you, Sanjay Puri, generally bipartisan support. From the time when Prime Minister Modi first came to America as Prime Minister 7 years ago to today? Do you see greater bipartisan support cutting across the usual Democratic-Republican divide or indeed divides within the Indo-Indian diaspora?
I think there's bipartisan support, but as I said, Rajdeep, this is not the same Democratic Party. There will be no blank check given to India or any country, especially when it comes to human rights, religious rights, at least from the congressional side. So the relationship is going to go on, as some of your other speakers have said, whether it's a Republican or Democratic. There will be priorities on certain issues like the Trump administration had. This administration and this Congress is a little bit different than the prior administration. And as I said, some of your speakers said President Biden doesn't want to talk about Afghanistan. That's an issue he really does not want to talk about. He wants to talk about China. He wants to talk about climate change. And I think that's where the focus for Prime Minister Modi should be. And I think that would behoove him.
You know, Michael Rubin, you watched Indian prime ministers come to America over the years. How is Mr. Modi now perceived, in your view, by the American establishment?
By the American establishment, Prime Minister Modi is still saddled with some of the rhetoric that occurred in the BJP before he became prime minister. There is an image problem. That said, I agree with almost every other speaker that the trajectory of U.S.-Indian relations is forward, and it doesn't just depend on one man. What I would just add in conclusion is while President Biden doesn't want to talk about Afghanistan, he justified his withdrawal in a pivot to Asia. And so there is an opportunity here for India to shape what that means, because if Biden doesn't take substantive effort to pivot to Asia, then he is going to be attacked in the 2022 midterm elections on what was the purpose of this withdrawal from Afghanistan in the first place.
Tanvi Madan, how is Prime Minister Modi perceived today in comparison to 7 years ago?
I think it depends on who you ask. For the reasons that others have alluded to. It's people have different perceptions. It often depends on what their interests with India are. I think the administration itself has found in him a partner that they can work with, who is willing and open to deepening cooperation with the US, including in the most sensitive sectors. And so, countries don't get to choose who is in, India doesn't get to choose who's in the White House, and America doesn't get to choose who's in 7 KCR, I still think of it as 7 RCR. And so you learn to deal with whoever's in the office. I do think, where it helps is if the maximum number of constituencies have a more positive impression. And that gives you kind of a broader base of support in the relationship. With all those constituencies pulling in the same direction, you can take a relationship further.
Navteej Sarna, if you had to give one final piece of advice to Prime Minister Modi as he prepares for this one-on-one in the Quad, what would it be?
Well, I think not for me to give advice, but I think the general direction should be that to build upon the strategic partnership and keep the focus of the US on issues which are important to us. What is important to us? They may not want to talk about Pakistan, but about Afghanistan, but what is important to us is what they do with Pakistan and what they do to contain terrorism emanating from Afghanistan and how they help our objectives of keeping engaged, at least in the humanitarian projects in Afghanistan. It's in our interest to work on the Quad along the lines of a positive agenda.
Is it in our interest to raise
China club?
Is it in our interest to raise issues of business concerns, of fewer H-1B visas, of higher fees for H-1? Are these all issues that we should be raising or not?
Well, there are a raft of trade and business related issues. I don't think they will get much time beyond the CEO's meetings to raise them here, but probably there will be a commerce ministers meeting soon after this. But here a broad direction can be given to give an impetus to the trade aspects which have been pending now for about almost 3 years. Market access issues, H-1B visa issues, GSP issues, and all that. All that is pending, and that needs to be taken out and removed from the problem area.
I want to thank all of you for joining us for, in a sense, setting the menu for what lies ahead over the next 24 to 48 hours. Always good to have clear, articulate voices on the Indo-US relation. Thank you all very much in Washington and here in New Delhi for joining me here on the news today.